William Wallace Denslow was born in Philadelphia in 1856, the second son of a tobacco wholesaler. In 1870, at the age of just 14, he attended New York's Cooper Union to study drawing for a few weeks, and 2 years later he enrolled at the National Academy of Design and studied there for a further 3 years. It's recorded that even in the early 1870s he was selling illustrations to magazines, but the earliest example of his work I could find was some particularly unpromising illustrations from 1878 for the book A Historical Sketch of Franklin County, Pennsylvania. Naturally enough, the book had a particularly limited appeal and did nothing to boost Denslow's reputation. Evidence of his work from this period isn't abundant, but he did create this collection of poorly printed chromolithographic postcards in 1881. And a few more equally unexceptional examples were used to promote a comedy stage show a year or so later. In 1882, Denslow married Annie McCartney, who gave birth to his son in the following year, but by then the couple had already separated, and he had relocated to Chicago, where he worked briefly for the Chicago Herald. In 1888, his humorous pen and ink illustrations for the book 20 Years of Hustling, written by J.P. Johnson, were published. And although not as lively or expressive as the similar work of his contemporaries, such as A.B. Frost, they did indicate that his technique and imagination had improved considerably since his unconvincing work of a decade earlier. In 1890, he created more monochromes for the book Dollars and Cents, a self-help handbook about how to achieve success in business, written by the entrepreneur and showman P.T. Barnum. Among other images, Denslow created this warning about the perils of drink, but ironically he was himself already consuming prodigious amounts of alcohol. In the middle of the decade, he began a successful professional relationship with the Roycroft group of artists and craftsmen who were based in Aurora, New York, and he created book cover designs and posters, some of which were used to promote the Roycroft group and their magazine, The Philistine. In 1896, he was one of 2 illustrators, the other being the now very obscure Ike Morgan, to create images for the book An Arkansas Planter, written by Opie Reed. And in the same year, Denslow married for the second time to Anne Holden. By this time, he had taken to using a graphic symbol of a seahorse to identify all his work, the significance of which escapes me, although such devices had been widely used by earlier Japanese printmakers. Not all his work at the time was connected to the Roycroft group, and he fell back on a more hatched and representational, overtly Victorian technique for the Montgomery Ward Company's 1898 almanac. A year later, Denslow wound up his association with Roycroft with a graphically decorated and minimally illustrated edition of Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and a final bleakly humorous poster for the Philistine. It was also in 1899 that he collaborated with the writer L. Frank Baum, and they had their first major success with Father Goose, his book. The only thing the book had in common with Mother Goose was that it contained rhymes for children, all of which were written by Baum. As no publishers had shown any interest in the book, the pair had funded the project themselves, and it became the best-selling children's book of 1899. Denslow's bold calligraphic line work and application of entirely non-representational colour overprints were every bit as vital to the book's popularity as Baum's contribution, and they shared the considerable royalties the book generated. But this success was soon outstripped only a year later with the publication of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz in 1900. The popular impact of this book was immediate and unprecedented. The first print run of 10,000 copies sold out in days, and subsequent editions in increasingly bigger print runs sold out just as fast. As with the previous collaboration, Baum and Denslow shared the copyright, and the royalties from the book's sales quickly made them both very wealthy. All the images were again created with Denslow's expected bold line, but the majority appeared in all manner of spot colour palettes of varying complexity, and not only were the spot colours printed in unusual combinations, but in many cases the line work itself was also assigned a colour. This was an unconventional step which, although not entirely successful in aesthetic or functional terms, it certainly gave the book a unique appearance at the time. Some of the pages, such as chapter titles, were printed more simply with just a single additional colour, but most of the narrative full pages were made up of highly complex composites of separate print runs, which Denslow assigned the colours to for the printers to follow. But however unconventionally coloured the very nature of the visual component of this book was, it surely had a very positive effect on its success, and The Wizard of Oz was widely considered an instant children's classic. Outside his collaborations with Baum in 1901, Denslow also had success with his syndicated colour-printed comic strip Billy Bounce, whose inflatable clothing allowed him the dubious power of being able to bounce over long distances. And in the same year, another solo project, Denslow's Mother Goose, was published, which, unlike the earlier collaboration with Baum, stuck to the expected traditional verses as published in many other editions by others before and since. And although far from an original idea, this jolly juxtaposition of rhymes and illustrations made for a very entertaining volume for small children learning to read. As with his illustrations for the Baum books, the images made great use of a limited colour palette of unusual but highly attractive appeal. And they were almost completely devoid of background work, focusing the reader's attention onto the various amusing characters featured as either smaller page decorations alongside the text or as full-page illustrations. In 1902, another collaboration with Baum, Dot and Tot of Merryland, was published. The version I'm showing here was printed exclusively in just black and green, but there's evidence of another from apparently the same year which favours the use of orange. Why this would be, I have no idea, and equally mysterious is that all the illustrations appeared more as what might be considered graphic devices than the expected full-page images used in The Wizard of Oz. And although it proved to be a reasonable success, Dot and Tot couldn't begin to replicate the same volume of sales as its predecessor. By this point, the relationship between Baum and Denslow had become far from cordial, and their partnership came to a sudden and particularly acrimonious end when they quarrelled about the sharing of royalties for the 1902 stage production of The Wizard of Oz with Paul Tietjens, who had composed all the music. After many heated arguments and Denslow's grudging agreement, production began a very successful run in Chicago late in 1902, and moved on to Broadway in the following year, where it was immensely popular with critics and the public. But Denslow and Baum's relationship was beyond repair, and they never worked together again. Nevertheless, the royalties from their previous collaborations and the Wizard of Oz stage show kept on coming. Denslow's Night Before Christmas was published in late 1902, featuring an unusual predominantly blue and yellow colour palette, which was even used for Santa Claus's outfit, which, although some were by now depicting his costume as red, it was far from universally taken for granted. In 1903, Denslow and his second wife divorced, at which point he relocated to New York City. And on Christmas Eve of the same year, he recklessly gave marriage a third shot with Frances Golson. It was also in 1903 that he began what would become an 18-volume series gathered under the collective banner Denslow's Picture Books. Astonishingly, all 18 were conceived, written, drawn, printed and published within a 2-year period. They followed the identical visual pattern of his previous successes, and even featured the same colour palette that he had successfully used on his Mother Goose book. Most were his own retelling, and in some cases complete reinventions of standard nursery rhymes and fairy tales, such as Humpty Dumpty and Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Denslow was particularly assiduous in the removal of the more brutal aspects of quite a few of the originals, believing that they were unsuitable for young readers. In visual terms, they were particularly forward-looking and predictive of what would later come to be seen as the norm in the recommended styling of books for what are now called early learners. These books were a considerable graphic distance from the more detailed pen and wash illustrations being created by virtually all his contemporaries in the USA and Europe. And although he wasn't unique in this regard, there were very few others making similarly radical modernist departures. He also took advantage of his ownership of the copyright to the illustrations of the bound books to create a newspaper comic strip featuring the Scarecrow and Tin Woodman. The strip was published in several newspaper supplements, and frequently it appeared alongside Bound's own, the now unfortunately titled Queer Visitors from the Marvellous Land of Oz, drawn by Walt McDougall. But despite its now parallel existence, Denslow's rendition of these two characters proved equally successful when published in book form. Yet again, Denslow didn't just illustrate the book, but designed the layouts and created quite a few pages which artfully combined the text with blocks of colour and illustrated elements. And the full pages were particularly energetic, with a large amount of slapstick knockabout scenes. In 1904 he collaborated with the writer Paul West to produce another equally attractive book, the fantasy story The Pearl and the Pumpkin. The narrative of this story was another fanciful affair, with all manner of characters, both human and anthropomorphized, colliding throughout. Admittedly, it trod conspicuously familiar Oz-derived terrain, but the fantasy narrative gave Denslow another ideal opportunity to produce yet more agreeably absurd illustrations. But when Denslow and West tried to adapt the book into a stage show, the cost of the production spiralled away from them, and yet again he found himself seriously in conflict with his partner. When the play finally made its debut in Boston, it was initially quite well received, but when it subsequently moved to Broadway, the reviews were not favourable, and more importantly, the public responded poorly to what was, to all intents and purposes, a rerun of The Wizard of Oz. Predictably, Denslow lost a lot of money on this doomed project. But despite the financial failure of The Pearl and Pumpkin, he took out a lease on a small island near Bermuda, which he renamed predictably Denslow Island. He had a spectacular grand house built on it, and he sailed his yacht The Wizard in the surrounding waters. In 1905 he also divorced his third wife, and mercifully she would be his last attempt. 1905 saw the publication of a couple of less ambitious projects, with monochrome pen and ink drawings for Richard Webb's comedic novel Me and Lawson, and a return to advertising work with a full-colour brochure for Duffy's apple juice featuring two typically rendered rather stout children and an imp who bore a significant resemblance to the Pumpkin character in his failed musical extravaganza. In 1906, Denslow revisited his earlier success with the comic strip Billy Bounce and reimagined the idea in book form, but it was not particularly well received by the public. He also attempted to get it made as a musical theatre production, but by this point his reputation for unreliability was preceding him and nobody could be persuaded to back his ideas. In 1907 he managed to return to children's books when he illustrated the story The Jewelled Toad, written by Isabel Johnson. In both narrative and visual terms it didn't stray far from the proven successful formula of little girl central character with silly but endearing fanciful characters in support, all involved on a mad convoluted adventure. But this adherence to the formula established with The Wizard of Oz was wearing thin with the public, and the book achieved only moderate success. Even with his extremely lavish lifestyle, it's hard to imagine how, but by the later years of the decade, Denslow had managed to spend most of the money he had acquired to date. Some sources assert that he made a series of bad investments, although nothing specific is quoted. But in 1909 he was obliged to give up his island and move permanently back to New York. By this point his drinking had rendered him an unreliable and temperamental alcoholic, and he was reduced to the creation of quite modest work, such as his line and wash monochrome illustrations for verses by Dudley A. Bragdon, published in Sunday magazine. And in the following year he returned to the production of comic postcards, some of which were themed for Thanksgiving and others which were used as advertising to promote various small businesses. And although 1909 also saw the publication of his book When I Grow Up, its particularly modest sales failed to turn his declining fortunes around to any significant degree. In the same year he created more advertising work which was not very well disguised as a children's picture book for Berry Brothers Varnish, featuring yet more of his child characters travelling the world with no apparent connection to the actual product. And significantly in that year the musical production of The Wizard of Oz ended its 7-year run, and that was the end of the income it had been providing. In 1910, Denslow was reduced to taking a fairly poorly paid job with the New York City Art Agency, and carried on with more advertising disguised as adventure picture books for a farm machinery manufacturer. Other similarly commercial work followed, in which he continued to attempt to trade on his former reputation as a successful and respected children's book illustrator, but it was all he could do to hold down his job with the agency. But in 1915 he had the good fortune to be commissioned to illustrate a cover for Life magazine. But he promptly spent the money he was paid on a monumental drinking session, which ended when he died of pneumonia in a New York hospital at the age of 58. It seems a particular pity that a man who had brought joy to so many children in his career as an illustrator should end his life so prematurely and unnecessarily. But we humans are flawed creatures and usually the architects of our own downfall one way or another. There was an undoubted element in Denslow's success of being in the right place at the right time, in terms of his fortuitous meeting with L. Frank Baum. This doesn't detract from the phenomenal level of his subsequent success, but equally I think it's true that many more accomplished children's illustrators didn't reach anything even approaching the success he owed to The Wizard of Oz. And it's all the more tragic that he allowed that success and the money it had made him to slip away so catastrophically.